Thank you for braving this more esoteric concept, podcasting. How many of you have listened to a podcast in the last 30 days? Okay. How many of you have a podcast of your own? A couple, all right. All right, well then, I know there's been a couple podcast-related sessions, so I'm gonna focus on how to build and market a podcast, but there are a lot of different aspects to it. You can follow me on the Twitter at Kent J. Lewis, the day job at Anvil Media. Feel free to use the hashtags liberally if you find any nuggets. So I'm going to be quick about me because I only have 30 minutes or less, but I've been running Anvil. We're a digital marketing agency out of Portland, Oregon since 2000. I started optimizing websites in '96, just a couple months after Al Gore invented the internet. I was there. And I've been an adjunct at Portland State for 19 years. I teach a search marketing workshop there, and I write for SmartBrief. And the reason why I'm up here, I think, is because for 5 years I had a weekly podcast called Dad's Unplugged. So it wasn't about digital marketing, my day job. It was about being a dad and feeling like, with my co-host and I, that there's more to being a dad than talking about sports and cars and booze and women or whatever. And so it was a podcast for dads. And there are a lot of them for moms, not very many for dads. And unfortunately, my co-host, who had broadcast experience, he and his wife started a company called Pagateam to host branded podcasts. This is 10 years ago, back when it wasn't cool. And they went bankrupt. So part of their strategy was to delete all of their podcasts off the internet. So I lost 5 years of our show, and I'm still a little bit pissed off about it. But I learned a lot, and I just launched a new podcast called Podcast for Closers with a friend of mine that is more about digital and sales and marketing. More on that later. So I'm going to touch on a few things, why I think podcasting matters for those of you that didn't raise your hand about doing your own podcast or somehow leveraging this podcast craze that's going on, and talk about mainly focus on the content strategy, and then we'll do a little bit of the marketing and some maybe Q&A if there's time. Usually there isn't. So you know the stats. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but basically almost everybody's heard of podcasts. A lot of people listen to them regularly. 124 million is, I think, a critical mass of a user base, and your customers or your clients' customers are going to be there in some fashion. And basically, the sweet spot is that age 25 to 54, technology enabled, a lot of commuters, you get their attention. While I'm a big proponent of video marketing and still am, there's something about podcasts, so you can listen to it on the go while you're doing other things, that you can get some listenership that you wouldn't necessarily get out of a vodcast or video. So there's definitely an opportunity there. And based on this Edison Triton research, you can see most folks are listening to between 2 and 5 podcasts. So there is an opportunity to be appealing to a broad audience and getting a lot of listenership through a podcast strategy. So a couple other thoughts to keep in mind. With so many podcasts being consumed, there's an opportunity now more than ever, not just to create a podcast, but to sponsor or advertise in podcasts. There are articles that I've been tweeting out and sharing about how brands are starting to get more engaged on the sponsor and advertising side. If you don't want to do it yourself, associate yourself with a podcast that's perhaps well-known within your target audience. And the interesting thing is that the 80% of listeners are consuming the entire podcast, which is a much higher number than those that watch video, right? The drop-off rate on you, if you look at your YouTube analytics, drop-off rates are like avalanche survival rates. They're very steep. So podcasts keep people more engaged, maybe because it's a slightly more passive medium, variety of reasons. And almost all of that's happening on a mobile device, of course. And a lot are actually listening at home versus only 23% in the car. So the commuters are a factor, but not nearly as much as chilling with your Google Home, your Alexa, your phone, or smart speaker. And so with over 500,000 podcasts available today, that's not episodes, that's podcasts, channels effectively. That is a rather large network. So the growth is there, the listeners are there, the market is there. Now, there's a quick question about why would you, as an individual or as a brand, want a podcast? One of the least talked about is it's a great stepping stone to before, if you ever want to speak at an event like this or speak in any way, cutting your teeth on a podcast is low risk, low stress, relatively, whether you have guests or not. It's a great way to just hone your speaking skills. It's also a great way to share the knowledge you have of your industry, your passion, whatever that is. Not everybody knows as much as you do about whatever it is you do. Some people may know more, but they may not be podcasting. There's obviously the marketing component. That's the most obvious. So I want to generate awareness for myself or my company. That's obviously a great way to do it. And then driving some sort of engagement metrics like subscribers, followers, site traffic, that sort of thing. I podcast mainly to share information and pursue the thought leadership status that is important as an agency owner. And some people just do it to build community. So you've got the Rogan podcast, like I would argue a failed comedian has become one of the most successful podcasters on the planet, and I'm still not sure how Joe does it, but he does. And so there also is the concept of the revenue channel. So you could generate revenue off sponsorships and advertising if that is an opportunity or of interest. So how do you get started? The first thing is and I always start with this with any marketing, you want to look at what are your objectives. Are you looking more at generating awareness for your brand or yourself? Are looking at owning a thought leadership role within your category? Just engaging your audience in new and interesting ways? Or is it a revenue strategy? I think revenue is probably the least common objective. Then you got to figure out the different strategies, tactics, and elements, like what kind of format, the duration, the frequency, the talent. What is your POV on this? How much is research versus guests versus news? And then just some of the elements of where do you want to host it, where do you want it to syndicate it? All of those are factors to consider. And then you got to make the investment. So you can be as little as free if you just want to use your phone. And some free software and free hosting. That's going to be pretty low budget, and it's going to have a limited impact. And then you can go big. So one of our clients, I hooked him up with a company called Digital One in Portland, where I'm from. He's a futurist. He came to me and said, I have this podcast. I have like 10 shows so far, and this is a year and a half ago. And can you help me promote these podcasts so I can get out there as a speaker, writer, and a consultant about the future of anything? And so he had done these on his own with a very simple mic setup. And what we did was spend more time optimizing his podcast. But while some of this, you might start at maybe $100 to $500 for the mic, the software, the mixer. You can obviously spend unlimited amounts, but really, if you're spending more than $1,500 to $3,000, you're probably taking it a little too seriously. The studio that we use at Digital One, they do a lot of voiceover work for Nike's in our backyard, and when famous musical artists come in, they do acoustic recordings there. So he has probably about a $3 million setup with multiple recording studios. So we record there, and it sounds absolutely amazing. But the recordings that we do for Podcasts for Closers is maybe $500 worth of equipment. And my co-host is a radio guy. He's a morning radio host. So he knows how to do this stuff. He bought all the equipment, and then we do the marketing. That's our partnership, and it's working well. And we just record at my office, and it's fine. So you don't have to go overboard, but I'd think about $500 is a good starting point for this equipment. So a couple things to be thinking about. I think the hardest part of our podcast, my buddy Mike Chase and I talked for about 2 years about doing a podcast. And in that time, everybody and their mother and their son and daughter are doing podcasts. Everybody's doing it. I think there's been a pendulum swing since Adam Curry from MTV fame kicked off podcasts in the mid-90s. Then it was kind of uncool for a while. Now it's really cool again, and it'll be uncool in about a year or two. But it will be powerful, and it will be, while the fad is over, it will be a powerful platform, kind of like blogging was 20 years ago. So the hardest part I've found is coming up with a name. I think the idea is like it's memorable, it's relevant, and then ideally it's optimized. So Podcast for Closers is really just a play off Coffees for Closers from Glengarry Glen Ross, and we didn't even really know what our full concept was. We just sat and started recording shows to refine it. But the idea is that once we figured out the name, it kind of sticks. I think that's important. So the other thing is, how are you going to describe it? So the way I have been describing Podcast for Closers is it's a look at how the art and science of influence and how to get people to do what you want them to do. And that may fall traditionally under sales and marketing, but it can become behavior. So we had one of our guests, Jamie Mustard, just launched a book called Iconist, and he talks about the concept of blocking. And the most famous speech of all time in all of history of man, does anybody know which one it is? Last time I asked, somebody actually knew. It's I Have a Dream. There's a guy somewhere from the South here, Martin Luther King Jr., they named a couple of streets after him. The I Have a Dream speech is the most known speech of all mankind, and it's because he was a master of blocking information. So I didn't know any of this, and we interviewed him. His book wasn't out yet. And my co-host, Mike Chase, was literally every question that he asked the author, he was like, wait, did you read my book? We're like, we didn't read your book because it's not out yet. So my co-host is really smart is what I'm saying. But the idea of blocking, I think, is really important to understand that you can use that in podcasting. It's a way to package information to maximize retention. And so I encourage you to check out Jamie Mustard's book, Iconist. But this is one example. This is our episode 3. Let's see, which one is this? It's about influencer marketing. And that's been kind of a recent thing we've been focusing on with our clients. And so if I wrote an article and I built a presentation about it, I might as well do a podcast on it because I can just look at my article or my presentation as speaking notes and we can record a 20-minute show, in this case 21 minutes, very, very easily. So the key is to optimize, the title, the description, kind of like basic SEO, so that it ranks well within we're hosting in Libsyn, but you want to get picked up on iTunes and all the other podcasters that capture the feeds and say, if you're looking for this information, here's a podcast for you. So that's really important. And you got to pick the right category. So is it business? Is it humor? What is it? And similar to how you would categorize a video on YouTube. And then the little elements that make it cool. So having a radio, 20 plus year experienced radio talent on air, he did intro music, he does amazing editing, he makes it seamless. That's what he does for his off day job is he does video production when he's not doing radio. So he's really created a good product for us, and then our job at Anvil is to optimize these podcasts. But we literally posted these Monday, so we're still refining the optimization syndication in terms of learning from experience. So hosting podcasts. So if you aren't ready to host, then you can partner. So you probably have some vendors or partners in the industry, maybe even a strategic client or a customer that you might want to, somebody has the technology know-how or the equipment, you have the knowledge or vice versa. That's a great way to get in affordably. Partnerships, or you can sponsor, and then you can do advertising. The public relations component was a session yesterday is how to become a guest on podcasts. So once a month, I'm a guest on a podcast, Mr. Social Entrepreneur, and he's like, what do you want to talk about this month? And I'll look at what article I just wrote and say, how about this? So I'm utilizing a lot of the content I've already been creating, and then that show, I did one with him on influencer marketing that's a different take on influencer marketing than the one I did for my own podcast. So I don't want to repeat the content, I want to take a different angle. But being a guest on podcasts is a great way to get your brand out there without having to deal with all the hardware, the software, and the headaches. And right now, costs are very affordable if you want to get in on sponsorship and advertising. I just tweeted out posted on LinkedIn a few articles about the transparency of advertising with audio and the tracking and the attribution. They're all working on that right now. So that will be improving quite a bit. But you can see this chart, especially, it's a little blurry, but right now, what most commonly happens when people listen to a podcast is they visit a sponsor's website. So that's compelling. For 5 years, Dad's Unplugged did not have a sponsor, and we didn't even bother to plug our own company, so best believe we do that with Podcasts for Closers. So make sure that if you're hosting a podcast, you're either sponsoring it yourself or your client or whoever. And then if you're promoting a product, give them a call to action. And then the other thing you do is when you do a recap of your podcast as a blog post or a summary, then you can embed links in there for that better tracking. So let's talk a little bit about content strategy. Now you have sort of a foundation. I know I'm either going to sponsor, I'm going to become a guest speaker, I'm going to do my own. So assuming you're going to do your own, let's talk about how you're going to build out the content. So obviously, just like video or the written word, writing articles, you want to be authentic, you want to be unique, you want to be intuitive and credible, and consistently good, right? That's the challenge with a lot of marketing today is, one good video and then that's it, one good blog post and that's it. So you don't want to be a one and done. In fact, we recommend recording 4 to 8 podcasts and launching them all and testing them before you really lock down your format and your frequency and all that, just to get some feedback. But if you do them one at a time, it's easier to batch it and then see how the reaction is. And that way you're starting with a critical mass, 4 to 6 at least, then they see you're taking it serious, right? So there's that intuitive, that trust that's built right away. So this Craving the Future is the podcast that we worked on, and there's a lot of little nuances like the pixel widths, and for the graphics, it's really important to have really catchy graphics. So that, that's like your album cover, right? Because this isn't video, this thumbnail is everything to it. I think it's probably, let's say, 30% of why people choose a podcast, beyond probably 40, 50% is the topic. The rest is going to be, is that thumbnail look legit? Does it resonate with me? That creative is very important. So this is my co-host, Mike Chase. We're recording in my office, and I was taking a picture trying to surprise him, and this is how he treats me. So he does have a silky smooth voice, I'll give him that. I've always said that I have a great face for radio, so I think it works out between us. We're a good yin and yang. But he is very well read. So whenever we're bringing up a topic, he's like, well, I think it was Nietzsche that said, and I'm like, dude, who has time to read? But anyway, so he's very well read, so we really complement each other. He's credible in radio, and in fact, when I first moved to Portland in 95, he was the part of this new radio station called NRK, and it was modern rock, basically. And I was just a foolish intern, and I started faxing him, because there was a thing called a fax machine back then. And I would fax him ideas for his radio show. I didn't know him. I just listened to the radio show, and I thought he was really funny. So I'd send him these really terrible ideas, and he'd use them from time to time. And then about 3 years ago, he said, hey, do you want to grab lunch? And I hadn't talked to him in 10 years. And he's like, I've been following you. You have a lot of information on digital marketing. And my day job, I'm trying to build a secondary career. And so we rekindled our friendship. And now it's led to this show. But I think it's really good to know that he has a lot of strengths in areas that I don't, so we complement each other really well. On Dads Unplugged, similar thing. My co-host did all the production, all of the editing. That was their job. That was their day gig. And he was the full ride tennis scholarship in college. He's this tall, good-looking guy, and he drives a Prius, and he does yoga, and he's all about the inner locus of control. And then on one of the first shows, I said, yeah, I put soap in my son's mouth because he wouldn't stop saying fuck. So, and my son incidentally didn't talk to me for about 2 years, so don't do that. If you don't have, I just couldn't think of anything else. He loved dropping F-bombs when he was like 3 years old. I don't know where he got it, must have been his mom. Anyway, on content strategy, I always start again with what are you trying to achieve, and then you try and map what you're trying to do with your audience getting some value, and somewhere in the middle is this magical podcast, right? So you start with what you're trying to do, and then what you might want to do as you're devising content beyond what you want to achieve is talk to the people that matter, the executives in your organization, other influential employees. I always found this to be true about social media. I've been consulting with clients on social media since '98, and you're like, how is that possible? Facebook wasn't a thing then. And back then it was telling kids on behalf of the record industry not to rip music on a site called Napster, which was a failing cause when you're talking to poor college kids with a lot of computing power. They were hacking everything digital. And so back then it was like, well, we only have this one person that gets social media. And it's like, well, we can train your whole organization how to do social. And that's what we've been doing for years. And I feel that content and podcasting is very similar. You have all these experts in your organization that are passionate about that thing. Maybe you all have a passion for the same industry or same discipline. That's great. You don't have to be it's not necessarily great to have 20 different hosts, but you have a ton of guests. If you have 20 people in your firm or 200, that's how many potential guests you have, right? Experts. And if they're not experts in something, why are they getting a paycheck? So they're good at something. And then you can reach out to your customers, your clients, your partners, vendors, looking for additional support, for content ideas, for content feedback, or to be the experts in that space. I like to do a quick competitive benchmark and see what other shows are out there today on this topic and what is their format and how can we be different. That's always smart. And look at what the industry is doing in terms of the publications in your space, the media. Is there a hole there? So one thing I did is Michael Perman, who is Craving the Future, that podcast, I introduced him to our local business journal and said, I think it makes sense if the business journal partnered up with them and he's the expert in the future as a futurist, and the business journal has a huge network and an audience. And interestingly, they decided, no, we don't need that because we only do podcasts that are sponsored by our advertisers, and we are not going to be in the thought leadership space at all. It's an ad revenue stream solely, and that was, to me, very disappointing. It was, I think, a great way to differentiate themselves as a business publication and media empire, but they chose not to go that way. But others might see the value in that. And then as you're building your content, you need to be doing a little bit of keyword research to figure out what kind of vernacular and language you should use. So the example I would give you is, having worked with a flat panel display company called Planar, one of my buddies has his own patent on this, but it was a touchscreen, right, that you put in a retail store like Nike, and you could order your pair of Nike ID shoes custom, and then they'd ship them to you. And he wanted to call this thing a dynamic retail display solution. And I call it a kiosk, and so would anybody else looking for it, because his language, however flourishing and smart and even relatively accurate, didn't exist. Nobody was searching on that term. So I said, let's optimize for kiosk, and then once they get to the website, we can unveil your brilliant language. Same thing with podcasting. You're going to talk in a certain language. Your customers may not share that language, that vernacular. Having worked with a lot of business-to-business clients over the years, I can tell you that every single one of my B2B clients in the tech space has a comprehensive integrated solution leveraging synergies cross-platform, shifting paradigms into the new millennium. And I still didn't tell you what they did. And that's the problem with being an SEO for so many years, search engine optimization, is my clients are full of shit. And they think they walk on water and they don't use regular English language when they're marketing their products. So that's been my job, and that applies here with podcasting as well. And then A/B test. So A/B test concepts, A/B test themes and formats. So I've done 5-minute podcasts and I've done 35-minute podcasts. And I don't assume anybody's going to listen to any of them, but at least it's good to test and look at drop-off rates to see what is your sweet spot. Right now, the average podcast is 22 minutes, and I'm not sure if that's because it's a standard 30-minute show with 8 minutes of advertising. Probably not. We know attention span for humans stays about 8 seconds. So keeping somebody 22 minutes is a small feat. But I've seen if you're going to go shorter, then you could go more frequent, like a daily 2-minute podcast or a weekly 10-minute podcast, or something like that. So look at your durations and make it work. We create an ebook out of this similar content on our website you can download that has more information. But again, this is another way to market your podcast, is creating other content assets that support the podcast, blog posts, videos, etc. Yeah. Yeah, Google Trends, Google Search, Google AdWords, and unfortunately some of the keyword tools that you've relied on that are free so long, some of them are now paid, but it's like $10 a month. And then we have, as a search firm, we have SEMrush and SpyFu and all these fancy tools. But just, I'd say Google Trends and Google Suggested Search is a good place to start, and it's probably all you'll need at this stage. Good question. Some tips and tricks. So start with who you know. There's no reason for me to go right to Seth Godin to interview him on a podcast, but I did have a chance to meet him about 10 years ago, and I bet I could reach out to him. He might even respond. And that way he can record the podcasts I do monthly with my friend out of Vancouver, Washington, just across the river. We just use Skype, and it's good enough. It's not as good as face-to-face with all the great equipment, but it's certainly good enough, and it's super easy for me. Log into Skype, talk for 20 minutes. 2 weeks later, I've got a podcast, and I didn't do any other work, right? So that guest podcast thing is a great way to go. But once you get, if you can kind of go with the biggest people in your network to get going, and you have a couple interviews, because the great thing about getting high profile folks as interviews is they tend to promote their podcast, your podcast to their network. It gets you out there faster. And then if you can leverage a mid-sized person, then we can go to the big person, right? So I may not start with Seth Godin, but I might work my way up after I have a couple other from local to regional to national level, in my case, maybe marketers. In your industry, you could go kind of work your way rippling out to who you really ultimately want to interview. But they were going to want to look and see at least half a dozen podcasts first, right? So you want to get those out the door and have them of decent quality. And then, you can create a series, right? So you might record, what we do is we batch Podcast for Closers. We'll record for an hour and we'll chop that into 2 or 3 episodes so that we record every other week for a weekly show. And it creates a lot more efficiency. And when we were doing Dads Unplugged, we do a Man Cave edition. We had Alec Baldwin's brother, Daniel Baldwin, is a merchant marine version of Alec Baldwin, meaning rough and tumble, very funny. He lived in Portland for a while. And we had a 3-hour recording with him, and we made about 4 shows. And as soon as we turned off the recording device, then he really lit up, and he was hours of entertainment. But anyway, so doing the batching, I think, is very efficient. I mentioned leveraging partners. And then you can do things like product reviews, unboxing, right? There's that 8-year-old kid that made $23 million last year on YouTube unboxing stuff. I mean, I still can't get over that. So we use Digital One for the really high-end work with Craving the Future, and it was kind of a strategic partnership test. He wants to hone, it's really going down market. Their studio is so powerful. They'll have VPN people in New York, athletes, whoever, for Nike, and it sounds like they're in the studio. You don't necessarily need that for your podcast, but I thought, let's start there and work our way down. And then with Podcast for Closers, a couple $100 worth of equipment, we're working our way up. And then I mentioned the keyword research, so we got ahead of ourselves, Google Trends and Google Suggested Search. That's one way to do it. And then the funnel-centric ideas, so there are different kind of topics that you can choose that work in different stages of the cycle. And this is a slide that I took directly out of my YouTube marketing deck, because it's no different. There are certain activities, certain interviews, certain show formats that work well for different stages of the buying cycle. And then when you're planning content, again, looking at the frequencies, we've touched on this. Are you going to do segments like a half-hour format like a daily show, or are you going to do something else? But I would say you want to probably keep it between 8 and 20 minutes. That's your sweet spot, and work up and down from there. You can storyboard, right, to get the fundamentals, especially when you're starting. In 6 years of podcasting, I've done exactly 0 storyboards, but I don't even practice my speeches, as you can probably tell. So this works really well if this is new for you, or if you come from a world of film and video, where that's a common technique. And try to look a little farther out than the next episode. That's what we do, and we should be looking farther out, like Craving the Future. Within 3 months of launching this podcast series, Hilton Hotels contacted him, flew him out to Chicago, put a big contract in front of him, biggest he's ever had as a consultant, to talk about the future of hotels. And he showed me some of the work that he did. It's all ethnographic research. It's really fancy stuff. And they're like, this is good. We want to look farther than autonomous driving cars that are miniature hotels. We've already been there. Let's go farther. So it all came out of this podcast as a marketing tool to get his biggest client yet. Don't forget the fundamentals. You've got to market your podcast like you market anything else. And so get it out there. We have a whole section now on our website next to our syndicated articles just promoting podcasts. And there are some other ideas, to leverage your guest network, looking at timely news, trying to beat things beat others to the punch, become your own broadcast news station. There are a lot of ways to create promos and cross-promote your podcasts, and repurposing that content for other ways. So a podcast, if you strip out the audio and transcribe it, you have a blog post or an article easily from a 10 or 20 minute, actually a long form article if it's like an interview. So it's a great way to create content. And you could video your podcast and use that content as well. We've done that a few times with one of our podcasts. It creates more value, and you can put it up on YouTube. So you get a copy of this, right? This was an updated version. I added a couple nuggets in here that are not in the one that's going to be available. So if you want to come up and get a card afterward, I'll get you this updated version. And I think we got 40 seconds for questions. But you can also email me if you don't want to come up and talk to me. That's fine. We don't have to interact. Yes. Oh, we don't pay, no, for them it's the exposure. I've never had somebody say no. And so they see the exposure, and when you show and they have something they can listen to see that you know what you're doing, it's a no-brainer for the exposure. It's definitely a quid pro quo, which is a topic these days. Any other questions? Yes, watch this. Back up, beep, beep. Wait, up, nope, too late. He killed me. Sorry, yeah, those are all hyperlinked, by the way, so when you get a copy, they're all clickable. And go to our website, the Insights section. We have the ebook, articles, blog posts, all about podcasting. And there's a service related to it, but it's all there on our website. Did you have a question? Yeah. Right, so the question is about analytics, and right now we're relying primarily on Libsyn with its limited analytics plus just Google Analytics for using UTM and making sure that when we're linking to it that we can see views. I think you really mostly want views and subscribers. And just remember to link them back with your call to action at the end. Go visit our website and then just see what kind of traffic you're getting, new refers, that sort of thing. And then the analytics will be improving, but they're remedial right now. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time. Hopefully this has been helpful.